Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So behind me is the house where Benjamin Disraeli lived from, if memory serves, 1859 to 73. So Benjamin Disraeli is best known for being Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but his longest stint as Prime Minister was 1874 to 1880, and he died the following year. So there you can see it. We're in Mayfair, which is an exceedingly chic area, and we're beside Park Lane, and beyond Park Lane is Hyde Park, which is the largest park in central London. The largest park in Greater London is obviously Richmond Park. So, like on the Monopoly board, Park Lane is the most expensive street, equivalent of Park Avenue in New York. So I don't want to say that much about Disraeli because I've spoken about him in another video. But Benjamin Disraeli was born in 1805 in London, and he was from a Sephardic Jewish family. His grandparents had come here from Italy and had prospered in trade. So his father was Isaac Disraeli, who was a notable bibliophile and small-time philosopher who could live as a gentleman of leisure. So they lived on Theobald's Road, and I filmed outside their original house. He had two brothers who both went to Winchester and then became civil servants. And he went to a private school in London. I can't remember the name of it actually. It was just Miss Weber School, the name of the man who ran it. Private said it was run for profit, it wasn't a charitable trust. But anyway, they were congregants of Bevis Marks Synagogue in the city of London. It's built on the side of the start of a 17th century Dutch church, mainly by Dutch Jews in the 17th century. But there was some sort of row between the family and the synagogue. I can't remember what it was over. So they took umbrage at that, and Isaac Disraeli said, "Right, that's it, we're off." And so they left Judaism, and he had his children baptized as Christians. And indeed in the Church of England, the most advantageous denomination to belong to, church in Holborn, St Andrews if I remember correctly, although Isaac Disraeli didn't belong to any religion. So Benjamin Disraeli, he later dropped the apostrophe from the name. It was Disraeli, as in from Israel. So just run together as Disraeli. Anyway, so he finished his schooling. He hung around his father's library for years, reading and doing very little and not actually having a job, so he was making nothing of himself, but was quite learned. And then finally he was toying with which side to go into in politics. Would he be a liberal? Would he be a radical? Actually, he ended up being a conservative. But obviously he was a man of thrusting ambition. Nothing wrong with that, but some people thought there was a distinct lack of principle on his part. A bit like Churchill, much after him. Anyway, so he tried several times to be elected, and it was known that he was Jewish, and there was some anti-Semitism around those days. People calling him Shylock as a slur, or waving bacon at him, asking, "Would you eat this? Are you really a Christian?" But he was made no secret of his Jewish heritage, and considered the Jews to be a very aristocratic race, and thought that the nobility should rule, or as he said himself, "I'm the missing page between the Old and the New Testament." So eventually he was elected a member of Parliament for Buckinghamshire, and Buckinghamshire, much of it has remained conservative ever since. So it's just the Tories who try to turn themselves into conservatives. So he sort of reinvented himself as a knight of the shires, and he was not from the squirearchy at all. He was a London business family, that's where he's from. Having affairs with married ladies rather older than himself, publishing his novels, Tancred, Sybil, Coningsby. There's a Coningsby Club in Oxford University for young conservatives to this day, and inventing the phrase "one nation," as in one nation conservatism, because in one of his novels, I forget which, he said that there was one character saying there are two nations here who are as different from each other in their modes of speech, their habits, their lifestyles, as inhabitants of two different planets. Another character asks, "What two nations?" And his interlocutor answers, "Why, the rich and the poor." So Disraeli wanted to breach the gap between the rich and the poor, and believed that the upper orders had a duty to look after those less blessed. So it was sort of noblesse oblige, and he went in for neo-medievalism, largely nonsense really, just propaganda to try and gull some people who think conservatives were paternalists. Anyway, so this is another angle of his house. How about that? Quite a place. I remember the late 90s, but the Mozambican embassy was a bit of this. I can't remember which particular bit, but very desirable residence. What a view they must have from up there over Hyde Park. which is behind me. Anyway, so Disraeli later married, but he and his good wife had no children. So he was briefly Prime Minister in the 1860s. Don't want to give you a rundown of the whole of his career. Occupied various positions. He wrote books blazoning forth the glories of the British Constitution and saying that even the poorest person has important rights, that people can't just search his house without a warrant and no magistrate dare imprison him against the law and blah, blah, blah. But so he said that the upper orders had a duty to care for the lower orders, and mere prudence would impel them to do so, saying the castle is unsafe if the cottage is unhappy, as in there might be a revolution. So when Sir Robert Peel, who lived down the street, like about 5 doors down the street, Conservative Prime Minister, said let's abolish the Corn Laws, Disraeli led the charge, accusing him of bad faith, of being a Judas and all the rest of it, and denouncing him in the purplest of prose. But a few years later, Disraeli had to say, well, he was right, and not reverse that, despite him having indulged in such operatics to say that the corn laws were to be defended to the death. That was a tax on the importation of corn to inflate the price artificially, which was very nice for the Conservative landowners who were making money out of selling corn. A stomach tax, a very regressive tax, which hit the poorest much harder than the wealthiest. Anyway, so in the 1870s, he was introducing some permissive legislation like the Artisans' Dwelling Act, the Food and Drug Act, to try and, well, improve quality of life and make sure people weren't poisoned by the things they were legally purchasing. Because in the early 19th century, you could sell almost anything. You didn't really have a duty to make sure that your goods were fit for purpose or safe or anything like that. But that was starting to change. So anyway, his nemesis was the Liberal leader, Gladstone, who was 4 years younger than him. Had more of an established background as in Eton and Christchurch, Oxford, although obviously Gladstone came from a trade family as well. And Gladstone was a high Anglican and sincerely religious, wrote books of theology, considered ordination. So Disraeli went to church, wasn't particularly religious. So I said that he sort of pretended to be part of the squirearchy, purchasing a house called Hughenden in Buckinghamshire, which still stands open to the public, a place of pilgrimage for young fogies, if you're a young Tory. So what else about Disraeli? It was his bright idea to have Queen Victoria crowned Empress of India. Now, she never set foot in Hindustan. She sent her firstborn, Edward VII, out to be crowned on her behalf. So Edward VII went to Delhi and they held a Durbar, despite the fact that the capital of British India was Calcutta in those days, or Kolkata as it is now. So Durbar can mean palace, but anyway, the emperor's camp was set up with tents, and the 585 princes of India, the various princely states, came to do homage to him on behalf of his mother, and that was that then she was Empress of India. I don't know how actually held the formal coronation for her. Obviously, Edward VIII returned in his own right to India for another Durbar after his mother died. So Beaconsfield, it's not pronounced Beaconsfield. Beaconsfield is a town in Buckinghamshire, and notably the youthful Tony Blair stood for Parliament there in the Labour interest in 1982 against Tim Smith. It had been the height of the Falklands conflict, and Tim Smith was keen to have himself filmed, listening anxiously to reports of the Falklands conflict. The Conservatives won hands down. Anyway, so Blair came a distant third, and Michael Foot, the Labour leader, said, "We're sure to have a very big future in Labour politics." Foot couldn't have known how correctly he spoke. Anyway, so back to Disraeli. So he didn't like Gladstone coming back with his Midlothian campaign because Disraeli pursued a realist foreign policy, all about pragmatism, not about ethics, as in propping up the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, against the Russian bear. The Russians must not have Constantinople, that being the refrain of a music hall jingoistic jingle. Anyway, then there was a big rebellion in Bulgaria, and I'm afraid to say that the Turkish army behaved deplorably. I realise in counterinsurgency campaigns, troops often behave badly, and some of them kill civilians, but this was really beyond the beyond on a very large scale, which is why Disraeli published his pamphlet, The Bulgarian Horrors, The Questions of the East. And he campaigned for Parliament in Midlothian, and indeed was elected, and gave dozens of stump speeches, often lasting a couple of hours. We don't see that sort of oratory these days. We wouldn't have the patience for it. Anyhow, so Disraeli didn't lead a real line of that row, but he lost the 1880 election. He was ailing. So Queen Victoria, when she heard that he was close to his demise, offered to visit him, but he declined on the basis she would only ask him to bring a message to her beloved Prince Albert, who'd fallen off his perch in 1861. So in memory of Benny Disraeli, the Primrose League was set up after his favourite flower. It emerged as another conservative organisation sometime afterwards. So he had some sort of funeral, not a state funeral, what would I say, maybe a national funeral at Westminster Abbey. Such was the rancour between him and Gladstone. William Ewart Gladstone refused to attend, saying he was too busy. I can't remember, I have a feeling he's interred in Westminster Abbey. So that is Benjamin Disraeli. Toodaloo.